If you are Indian, African, African American, or even European, then listen to this story very carefully, because this isn't just history. This is your history. This is the story they buried in footnotes, whispered in shadows, and erased from textbooks. This is the story of how one African king shook the world without a war, and how the world tried to forget him because he didn't fit the script. Imagine that you had so much wealth that you could collapse an entire economy of a continent, not just a country. You didn't ride to war, you didn't rule by sword. Yet when you step onto the sand, the world moves. Across the burning heat of the Sahara, a golden procession stretched for miles. Not one caravan, but hundreds. Not one chest of treasure, but entire trains of camel, each burdened with hundreds of pounds of gold, so pure it shimmered like sunlight frozen in time. Behind them marched 60,000 peoples, soldiers, servants, scholars, and singers, all dressed in fine silk and dyed linens, moving as one beneath a sky that had never seen such wealth. It was not a parade, it was a power on pilgrimage. He fed the poor, he built mosques, he gave so much gold away that entire economies collapsed from kindness alone. In cities like Cairo, merchants whispered his name in awe. In courts of Europe, cartographers who had never met him began drawing his face on maps, crowned, robed, holding a golden orb. To them, he was a myth. But in reality, he was real, he was devoted, he was brilliant. It was estimated that his gold was valued at $400 billion at its peak. $400 billion is just a measure. We know he was the richest man who ever walked on the face of the earth, and yet today, most of the world has never heard of him. His empire, once vast and dazzling, lies buried beneath centuries of dust and silence. His name, Mansa Musa, has been forgotten by the very civilizations he once humbled. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This is the truth carved into the forgotten sands of West Africa. The story of a man whose footsteps left gold in their wake, and whose legacy echoes far beyond the empire he built. Welcome to CTT Stories, ladies and gentlemen, where forgotten wealth rises from the dust. And history is told not with dates and numbers, but with heart, silence, and stones. Today, we journey to the edge of the Sahara, to a time when West Africa was not only thriving, but leading the world in wealth, culture, and vision. This is the true story of Mansa Musa, a king whose name once shook the foundations of kingdoms far beyond his own. A ruler whose generosity bent economics, whose faith carved monuments into the earth, and whose empire, Mali, stood as a beacon of African brilliance long before the world was willing to see it. This is not just the story of the richest man who ever lived. It is the story of how power, faith, and legacy can shine brighter than gold, even if the world forgets your name. Long before the ship of Columbus crossed the Atlantic, long before the rise of Florence or the fall of Constantinople, there was an empire shining in the heart of West Africa. An empire so rich, so vast, that gold was as common there as dust in the wind. This is the Mali Empire, and at its peak in the 14th century, it was one of the most powerful forces on earth. Its borders stretched across desert and forests, from Atlantic Ocean to the edge of the Red Sea trade routes. Inside its domain stood legendary cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Niani, not only centers of commerce but of religion, law, and higher learning. These weren't small tribal settlements. They were cities of stones and songs, where judges ruled by Quranic law and scholars debated under the shade of ancient babao trees. And at the very core of this empire flowered one thing more valuable than any crown: gold. Mali sat upon the golden veins of Africa, mines so deep and plentiful that some accounts say half of the world's gold supply came from West Africa during the medieval period. And it was here, amidst the wealth and wonder, that a boy named Musa was born. He wasn't the heir to the throne or a child of kings. He was appointed as deputy ruler when the reigning emperor Abu Bakr II set off an ambitious sea voyage to explore the Atlantic. When the voyage failed and the emperor never returned, Musa became the Mansa, king of kings, and inherited one of the richest kingdoms the world has ever known. But Musa was not content to simply hold a throne. He had vision, he had faith, and he believed that the king's legacy was not built in silence, but in stones, in learning, and in unity. He expanded Mali's border with wisdom, not chaos, annexing neighboring lands through diplomacy, strategic marriage, and, when needed, conquest. He brought under his rule vast territories that today stretch across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Niger, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. He didn't rule through fear, he ruled through structure. Mansa Musa reformed taxation, he stabilized trade, he built garrisons not just for defense but peacekeeping. The trans-Sahara trade routes, once vulnerable and fragmented, now pulsed with goods and ideas. Salt came from the north, gold from south, ivory, textiles, slaves, book, and cola nuts traveled across continents. And with each passing year, Mali rose higher, its economy flourished, its cities thrived, its voice echoed across the sand, reaching distant lands that had never heard of African power before. At the center of it all stood Mansa Musa, silent, devoted, and calculating, a man shaped by faith, a ruler preparing to make history, and soon the world would know his name. In the year 1324, after years of expanding and strengthening his empire, Mansa Musa made a decision that would ripple through history. He would undertake Hajj.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
The sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, as required by every faithful Muslim. But Musa's Hajj would not be a quiet act of devotion. It would become the most extravagant journey the medieval world had ever witnessed. He left his empire with a caravan so vast, so surreal, that eyewitnesses would struggle to describe it without sounding like poets. 60,000 attendants, 12,000 slaves, all dressed in flowing robes of fine silk. Hundreds of camels, each burned with up to 300 pounds of gold dust and ingots. Trumpsters, dancers, warriors, and scholars followed in waves. This was not a pilgrimage, it was a moving empire. The Sahara trembled under its weight. Cities along route watched in awe as Musa's caravan passed through, feeding the hungry, paying debts, and building mosques in his wake. No village was too small to receive his generosity. No stranger was too lowly to earn his blessings. But the most astonishing chapter of this journey came in Cairo, Egypt. There, Mansa Musa met with Mamluk Sultan, dazzling the Egyptian court with gifts beyond imagination. He gave so much gold to merchants, nobles, and the poor that the price of gold plummeted. Inflation swept across Egypt, causing a financial crisis that lasted over a decade. A single act of kindness, had upended an entire economy. And yet, this was not recklessness. It was a reflection. Mansa Musa believed wealth was a divine test, not a treasure to hoard. After Cairo, he continued on to Mecca, fulfilling the rites and Hajj and Solomon grace. He prayed among pilgrimage from Persia, Byzantium, and India, yet stood apart not by title but by presence. His humility spoke louder than his gold. Word of his journey began to spread like wildfires. In Europe, where little was known of Africa beyond its coasts, cartographers began drawing new maps on the famed Catalan Atlas. Musa was illustrated sitting on a throne holding a globe of gold. To those who had never seen him, he became a symbol of power, of mystery, of limitless wealth. But to those who did see him, he was something greater. He was a ruler with a vision, a man of faith, generosity, and discipline. And as he turned his caravan towards home, the Islamic world watched with reverence, and the rest of the world watched with awe. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali, he was no longer just a king. He was a legend. The sands of the Sahara remembered his footsteps. The court of Cairo whispered his name. But what came next was not rest. It was a renaissance. Musa didn't return with just stories. He returned with architects, scholars, poets, and jurists from across the Islamic world. Among them was the famed Abu Ishaq al-Shaili, a brilliant Andalusian architect whose influence would reshape Mali's cities for generations. In the heart of Timbuktu, Musa commissioned the construction of the Jingerbar Mosque, a monumental structure built from mud, brick, and wood, standing like a fortress of faith against the desert winds. Its walls were not just places of prayer. They were statements of cultural brilliance. Today, nearly 700 years later, it still stands, weathered but unbowed. Musa began transforming Timbuktu into a hub of Islamic learning and trade. He funded madras, built libraries, and imported books from Cairo, Baghdad, and Fez. Scholars from across North Africa and Middle East traveled to Mali, drawn not by war or conquest, but by knowledge. In these classrooms of sand and sunlight, students studied astronomy, law, mathematics, and philosophy. The name Timbuktu, which to the outside world would one day become synonym for the farthest place imaginable, was at the time the very center of African intellect. Musa's vision was clear. Wealth could build walls, but wisdom could build civilizations. And so, gold that had once dazzled foreign markets now funded institutions of learning. Camels that once carried treasures now brought manuscripts and scholars. Faith once expressed through private prayer now echoed through architecture, art, and law. Under his leadership, the Mali Empire became a cultural superpower, a place where trade, caravans, and theological debates shared the same streets, where the Quran was studied alongside astronomy, where black African rulers didn't imitate the world, they led it. It was a golden age built not just on riches, but on values, faith, wisdom, justice, and progress. For 25 years, Mansa Musa ruled the vision and clarity. And by the time his reign ended around 1337, he had left behind something far more lasting than gold. He had turned Mali into a civilization that could echo through time. So, when Mansa Musa passed from this world, the golden glow that had lit the empire began to flicker. Not all at once, not with fire or conquest, but with time, with silence. His son Mansa Magha took the throne, but lacked his father's vision. The gold was still there, the trade routes still pulsed, but something was different. The foundation, the balance between faith, learning, and power had begun to shift. Over the next century, the Mali Empire saw a string of rulers rise and fall. Some tried to expand, others simply held on. The once vibrant cities of Gao, Timbuktu and Niani continued to breathe, but the breath was shallower as new threats emerged from the Songhai Empire, and shifting trade routes pulled wealth towards the coast. Mali began to retreat from the world stage. By the late 1400s, European powers began circling West Africa's shores, hungry for what lay inland. They did not come seeking culture or wisdom. They came for gold. They came for slaves. And in the centuries that followed, the world that Mansa Musa had built, an empire of scholars and mosques, of law and balance, was buried beneath colonial ambition and rewritten history. Even Timbuktu, once a beacon of intellect and art, fell to obscurity. Its libraries were raided, its scholars forgotten. The manuscripts, thousands of them, were hidden in caves, homes and cellars, protected by families who remembered what the world had tried to erase. And Mansa Musa, he vanished from most history books written outside of Africa. His name was silenced, not because he failed, but because his success didn't fit stories others wanted to tell. An African king who outshined European monarchs, a Muslim ruler who brought peace through intellect, a black emperor where gold was abundant, but dignity was the true treasure. The history was too powerful, so it was buried, but it never disappeared. And now, nearly 700 years later, his story is rising again, not through conquest, but through curiosity, through voices like yours and platforms like this that seek not to rewrite the history itself, but to remember it. So, do you mind answering me? What is legacy? Is it the gold you leave behind? The buildings you raise towards the sky? The lines etched in books? Or the whispers that pass from one generation to the next? For Mansa Musa, it was never about gold alone. It was about what gold could build. It was about using powers to elevate, not dominate, to bring books to the desert, not just bricks, to forge an empire where faith and intellect walked side by side. His world has faded. The places of Niani have crumbled. The libraries of Timbuktu are hidden behind worn wooden doors, watched over by elders who remember stories no textbook ever told. But his impact is not gone. It lives in every manuscript still being translated, in every mosque still standing under Saharan skies, in every African child who learns the name Mansa Musa and realizes that their history didn't begin with colonization. It began with greatness. We live in a world that often forgets who built the roads before us. But legacy is not erased by silence. It carried quietly, powerfully by those who choose to remember. So the next time someone asks you about the richest man in history, tell them his name. Tell them about the gold. But more than that, tell them about the mind behind it. Because empires fall. Wealth fades, but vision that lives forever. History didn't forget Mansa Musa. It erased him. Erased him from your school books. Erased him from the maps. Erased him from conversation about greatness because his story shattered the narrative that power, brilliance and wealth only wore pale skin and spoke European tongues. But the truth has a long memory, and silence doesn't last forever. Wherever the European powers set foot, they didn't came in search of knowledge, culture or wisdom. They came to divide and conquer. They didn't seek scholars. They brought chains. They didn't admire architecture. They tore it down. They didn't exchange ideas. They extracted wealth from Africa to India. They took trillions, not in stories, but in gold, spices, artifacts, people and pride. Entire civilizations were hollowed out, not by war, but by greed wearing the mask of civilization. They rewrote histories not to preserve the truth, but to erase the brilliance that threatened their dominance. They did not civilize, they colonized, and they did it with a smile in one hand and a sword in the other. But here's the twist history didn't see coming. Greed turns inward. And now the same empire that once looted the world are collapsing beneath the weight of their own lies. Their monuments are cracking. Their economies are trembling. Their unity is unraveling, not by outsiders, but by the very greed they once unleashed across continents. What they buried in dust and silence is now rising through voices like ours. And here at CTT Stories, we don't surrogate history. We tell it as it happened, raw, powerful, and unfiltered. Because the truth doesn't need permission, it just needs a voice. This wasn't a story about gold. This was about how power can be graceful, how black leadership once built cities of learning, trade, and law, while Europe still stumbling in darkness. This was about how a king used faith, intellect, and generosity to move the world without even firing an arrow. Mansa Musa was not an exception. He was a reminder that Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was already leading. At CTT Stories, we don't chase forgotten stories. We resurrect them. We tell history not as it was sold, but as it was lived. Loud, grand, human, and unshakably real. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you rethink what you thought you knew, hit like, subscribe, and pass it on. Because algorithms won't lift stories like this. People do. You do. Drop a comment below with legacy lives. If you believe it's time we stop waiting for permission to remember our greatness. And never forget, an erased king is still a king. A buried story is still true. And here at CTT Stories, we don't just tell the past. We demand it echoes. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.